My creed as a Canadian is summed up in these words. I am a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind, for I am a Canadian.
I'm at Freedom Talk in part because I love freedom and I love talking, and in particular I love talking about freedom, so it's a great opportunity. But on a more serious side, I feel that it's never been more important to talk about freedom and the values that a lot of people loosely in the Freedom Coalition in Canada can all agree on. And you know, we may disagree on, you know, individual things like, you know, what the best way to do this policy is or how best to navigate this particular challenge. But generally speaking, I think that the COVID pandemic has really caused a lot of people to reevaluate those traditional battle lines. And I think among people who like liberty, there's a lot more that connects us than divides us.
Mm-hmm. And what's unique about Freedom Talk?
Freedom Talk is one of the only groups in the country that so consistently and persistently has these very difficult discussions. And that's not to say that other groups don't. There are a number of independent media platforms and right-of-center organizations that engage in this space. But when I think about Western independence and alienation, when I think about a lot of these green policies that are just crippling economies in Canada and are only going to get worse, when I think about free speech, all of these things are issues that Freedom Talk conferences tackle and are unafraid to do.
Mm-hmm. And today you talked a bit about freedom, but you actually have a book out about the Freedom Convoy. Could you tell us why did you write the book, and you know, what's it really about?
I wrote the Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world, for a number of reasons. One was because I wanted to read it. There was so much that I wanted to learn about this, and I kept sort of wondering who's going to be the one that digs into this and answers all these questions. And a friend of mine eventually said, shut up and write it yourself. So I did, because I learned that from being on the ground in Ottawa for parts of this thing, there was a lot more to the story that wasn't being told by the mainstream media or was being completely misrepresented by the mainstream media. And I really wanted to write that proverbial first draft of history about this tremendous episode in Canada. And the book is sympathetic, but not sycophantic. You know, people could read it who don't like the convoy and still come up with a better understanding of it. But it really was a truly unique and I'd say significant moment in Canadian history. And I wanted to be a part of documenting that.
Well, I think you did a great job of it. And can you tell us also a bit about your buddy on the ground there, Rupa Subramanya?
Rupa Subramanya is fascinating because I had corresponded with her in the past and I had read her columns in the National Post, but I didn't know her all that well and had never met her. And she did something in Ottawa that was truly exceptional. And I mean, sometimes people reinvent the wheel and they find new ways of doing things. And she took journalism and came up with something that no one had ever apparently figured out, which was this concept called talking to people. And I know it seems radical in this climate, but every day she lived in Ottawa, she went around and just talked to people and asked them who they were and what their stories were and why they were there. And she came up with one of the most human portraits, I think, of who the people in the Freedom Convoy were.
Yeah, I remember seeing, I think it was one of her first tweets that said that her cat was in the window looking out and she said, I'm going to go downstairs and meet my new neighbors. And I thought, wow.
What Rupa did is exceptional for a number of reasons, but a lot of journalists in Ottawa were really doing office window reporting. They were looking out of their office window down on the streets and trying to get a sense of what was happening. And there were only a few that were really unafraid to go out into the crowd. And you know, Rupa, who is not a tall woman, she's a woman of color, of Indian descent, she was saying, well, you know, I'm going to go out there and this misogynist racist group, you know, who knows what's going to happen to me? But clearly nothing did. She ended up being out there for weeks on end. I don't know if it was every day, but certainly pretty close to it, and did a lot of tremendous work in the process.
Yeah, and I think you cite her quite a few times in your book.
Yeah, I do, and I cite her as an example of a journalist that was unafraid to talk to people, and I think it's important to note that I've literally written the book on the convoy, but I don't claim to be the sole authority on this. I did a lot of interviewing with organizers to try to get their stories. I did a lot of research into reporting that existed, and I just did a lot of personal observation, things that I saw and felt. But this was a story that more people should be telling, and I think it's actually quite shameful how few have wanted to tell that. And I look, for example, at my book and the mainstream media blackout when it came out and became a #1 bestseller for much of the summer, and the reviews in the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the CBC, and coverage in mainstream media has been combined 0. Absolutely none.
That's disgusting. And so now the last topic we had mentioned was how do you see freedom of speech and freedom as the cornerstone, I think one time you said, of democracy?
Freedom of speech is the hill to die on for me, because it's the gateway to other freedoms. If you don't have freedom of speech, you can never debate economic freedom. You can never debate freedom from government coercion. You can never debate freedom from government intrusion in your own decision making. Without freedom of speech, and I'd say democratic freedoms as well, you can't really advocate for anything else that matters. And it is particularly concerning to me that we have a government that holds free speech in such contempt. And I would say that even freedom itself is something that we need to defend, not just in practice, but defend in branding. It used to be that I think everyone would acknowledge, left or right, that freedom was an inherently good thing. And maybe you have different takes on what freedom is and which freedoms are more important. But right now you have mainstream media outlets in Canada that say freedom is a right-wing term, and that freedom has become the language of extremists. And when we let people brand freedom as extreme, we've lost the battle and we'll never be able to win another one. So I think it's important to fight for freedom. I also think it's important to continue to fight for this idea that freedom is a good thing and the pinnacle of what any prosperous society must be striving to.
Great. And how can people see more of your work? Can you tell us a bit about what you do and where?
I'm very privileged to be a senior journalist at True North, which is where I host the Andrew Lawton Show and do some written reporting and often pop up at events across the country when I think there's a story there that needs to be told. So people can always find my and my colleagues' work over at tnc.news. And I also, of course, have the book, and I try to tweet as much as I can about things that are going on. And I also do a Substack newsletter, which is called Andrew Lawton, very creatively.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate talking with you.
This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind, for I am a Canadian.